Writing one half of the population shouldn't be that hard, but apparently it is for some people. I think what gets in the way for most is a superficial overcorrection in terms of depicting women. I don't think I need to mention that it's kind of distracting when you're reading a book and the description of every male character focuses on his face or his hair, and then the first woman you meet, sometimes the only woman you meet, is immediately described as sexually as possible. Let me give you an example from a book I was recently reading, actually. Quote, Magda looked down at herself and saw she was still in her nightgown, the blue flannel one, tied at the throat and sleeves and loose all the way down to the floor. Her breasts, although not large, jutted out shamelessly under the soft, warm, heavy fabric, free of the tight undergarments that imprisoned them during the day. She quickly folded her arms over them. End quote. For a while I thought descriptions like these just weren't that common. But then I realized it was my mistake that I was reading books which are way too good on average, and it's actually quite common if you go to a certain segment of commercial fiction. Let's start off with an easy question. Is this offensive? And the answer is maybe to some people. I personally don't find it offensive, but I do find it distracting. I also find it odd that the author decided to implement this description during Magda's own point of view, as if he's somehow ashamed of showing the male characters sexualizing her directly. Almost as if there's a certain reluctance in portraying the male characters as having the male gaze, as if that somehow reflected poorly on them. Now, I'll be honest, if the above description came through the male gaze from one of the men in the story, I'd find it a lot less distracting, especially if we're talking about some young horny dude. But I think the part that would be seen as condescending by the female readers is that this part is given to a woman, as if she's the one that's obsessed with how attractive her own body is. And this character is not a model, she's not a celebrity, she's in a desperate circumstance in which her physical attractiveness is probably the last thing on her mind. So while I don't think the description itself is necessarily degrading, I do think the context in which it's placed kinda is. Like, what are you trying to say about this character when this is what she's thinking about at the most inappropriate time ever? I don't think overtly sexual descriptions are always inappropriate. Probably depends a lot on what you're writing and who you're writing it for. But always keep in mind, anyone could and should enjoy your novel, and there's no reason to purposely annoy or alienate female readers with stuff like this. You also need to keep in mind your character. Some people are very proud of their physiques, and I think it would be weird here to discriminate and only place men in this category. There's a 1% of men and women out there who are not only obsessed with their appearance, but extremely forward about showing it off at every point. But that's not everybody. And just to make it clear, in the novel I quoted from, A Horror Called The Keep, this happens over and over with this character Magda. Lewd descriptions of her appearance are the main thing the author is focused on during her POV segments, and it stands out in a distractingly bad way, considering that the rest of the novel treats the topic with a certain degree of seriousness. Now, if this were some noir story, and a main character was some womanizing detective who saw women as sexual objects, it would make sense for that character, and it might even be a part of his arc. Of course, some people would still be annoyed by that, but you're always going to annoy some people. Just keep in mind that there's always a difference between tasteful, titillating paragraphs at the appropriate time and the right sort of story, and randomly dropping a very insistent description of a girl's boobs. There's a piece of advice that's often given to men who struggle writing female characters, which is that they should write the entire book only with male characters and gender swap them at the last moment. I could see this working for some things. If you have a really driven, career-focused character with barely any social relations, then yeah, I don't think them being a man or a woman is going to make a huge difference. But would this always work as a rule? I feel like that's not the case. Could you write a story about the American mob and turn some of the characters into women? Obviously not. You'd have to think of them being women from the beginning to properly integrate them into the story. And this is not necessarily a commentary on men and women being intrinsically different and having to be written differently. It's not really about the character and their inner experience at all. It's more about how other characters and society in general reacts to them. Society is going to react very differently to the same exact traits, depending on whether they're exhibited by men or women. At this point, people have become so self-conscious about depicting women in a bad light that it's like they're almost afraid of mentioning women having long hair, or wearing a dress, or wearing makeup. Not every female character needs to be some physically adept tomboy, or some short-haired, muscular, androgynous, sword-wielding killing machine. It's okay to write women and present them as feminine and physically weak. Most of them are feminine and physically weak, and that's not a character fault. If you think wearing a dress or liking makeup or being physically fragile are unforgivable sins, then that's a you problem. Admittedly, the worst thing is seeing women being written as having no flaws whatsoever. They don't lie, they don't cheat, they don't steal. Always the good person, never the bad person, and always a winner. Now that, my friend, is awful, and it would be awful regardless of whether you're writing a man or a woman. The most essential thing about a character is that they need to be flawed, and they need to lose, and lose a lot. It doesn't really matter who you're writing about. I mean, most people are losers, but even winners lose some of the time. If you write a woman being a non-stop winner and a non-stop victim of circumstance, then you're just taking away that character's humanity. It's okay to lose. It's even okay to be a scumbag from time to time. These are all human qualities. There's nothing that builds empathy or connection with a character like watching them have the shit beaten out of them, physically or metaphorically. But you need to be careful with that. You also don't want a character that gets victimized all the time. Like maybe your female character gets her ass whooped. And you know what? Maybe she deserves it. Whatever character you choose to write, she has hundreds of pages to work through her issues and come out the other end a better person. This is why we read and write stories, to see characters transformed. If you're writing a woman as being flawless, you are doing everyone a disservice, and women most of all. And look, yes, both men and women employ tropes when writing. Male authors tend to favor depicting women in a certain light, and female authors also have their preferred ways of looking at men. But the difference is that women don't tend to rob men of their humanity. Even if the men in their stories are stereotypical and meant to serve as a female fantasy, they're still flawed. They still make mistakes. They retain their humanity. Whereas some male authors tend to have two modes. Either the woman is a stick with tits attached, or she's a literal angel who does no wrong and has no faults and no flaws. Or she's just both. And that's terrible. Not because it's a fantasy that a person is living out in their writing, but because it's soulless. Even if you want to stress the sexuality of your female characters, they still need to feel like people, with feelings and flaws. I also want to mention one thing, which is very specific, but I see it occurring so much that it really pisses me off. A lot of people don't know how to create conflict in stories naturally, so they'll take their male protagonist, they'll give him a wife or a girlfriend, and then they'll make that woman a source of conflict. Why? I get that it's easy, but it's so boring. And there are so many stories of the superhero or the detective who gets shit from his wife because she just wants him to stop doing his job. And like, why? Why would you do this? Is this just some garbage modern take on relationships being bad? It's such a relief to me when I see a story and the wife or girlfriend is actually supportive and nice. You know, how like they would be in real life 99% of the time. I'm not joking when I say that the bitchy, unsupportive wife is probably the trope I hate the most. Failed and toxic relationships are a horrific and overplayed trope in general, but the obsession with making the wife the dumb bad guy of the relationship is just so boring. And every time a woman is written that way, it's so condescending, as if a wife would be totally unreasonable when her husband is out there saving the world or doing an extremely risky thing. I hate it. I really hate it. Even arguably really good things like Breaking Bad are plagued by this. It's just so widespread, and that's unfortunate. Even if it could be done well, at this point it's so overdone that I think it just needs a long pause before it's taken up again. For the final segment of this video, I thought it would be only right that I ask some questions about writing female characters of an actual woman. So naturally I bothered my girlfriend, who also writes. Question number 1. What bothers you in how some female characters are written and described? We live in a media climate that is very tense on how it portrays women. Most women that I see written nowadays are hardly wallflowers, but instead are strong and emancipated. This is not so much a bad thing as it is rather boring and predictable. I think more than anything we like variety in the depiction of women. Women's temperaments seem to wane with trends. We're now in a more feminism-inspired wave of girl power independence, and we've had the era of the woman whose only character trait is being sexy. If we go back to the golden age of Hollywood, you will even find women so passive that they do most of the acting with their eyes. All these women should be written when their presence is called for, but the problem arises when a set of characteristics becomes trendy and thus feels less realistic or sincere. It feels more like a gender-swapped male character or a cardboard cutout of a female character than it feels like a person who happens to be female. Question 2. What traits do you think are most lacking in female characters as depicted in media? Personally, I think we see too few women that have traditionally feminine interests and personalities. I think right now we have a lot of girl boss representation and the occasional sexy, useless character. We hardly see girls who are caring, tender, and yielding, who care about a particular craft that they love, and if they have one, their family. So of course, not all women are this way, but surely some are. Especially if you write in a historical setting. This was upheld as the feminine ideal for much of Western society. I think writers can be scared to write such aggressively tradwifish characters for fears of being cancelled. But I think that is not something to be scared of if you write with respect and empathy for women at large. It can actually be highly original and interesting to add characters like these to your cast, as it can diversify the types of dynamics they have. Question 3. What stereotypes should be avoided? In an ideal world, I would say none. Some women are the stereotype, and that's not bad or off limits. The problem is in numbers. If you have 3 major female characters, not all of them should be the stereotypical dumb hot woman, unless you really have no logical alternative. Reasoning is important as well. Are you writing a dumb hot girl because you have a wish fulfillment fantasy about having a bimbo girlfriend? Do you hold a grudge against a particularly bossy employer who happened to be a woman, and now your female general is a short-haired, shouty lesbian? Think twice about springing for cheap stereotypes. You can definitely channel your emotions, but try not to rely solely on cliché. Think about what other traits, less obvious ones, you want to include. Perhaps the stupid, frivolous princess is altruistic and nosy, and the shouty general is highly intelligent and jealous of anyone who speaks to her girlfriend. This will instantly enrich your characters and make them less obvious. Question. What do you think differentiates or should differentiate female characters from male characters? Women have different struggles than men. Even if you write a setting wholly different from the world as it is, you can use this. Women have different physicalities, different roles in traditional society, different skill sets that are traditionally taught to them, etc. Having this as a part of your story can really highlight the tensions and characters within your story. The traditional rebel princess trope is a common example of this, but you could also consider things such as a seamstress that turns to making chainmail when a war is declared, or a female spy posing as a nurse who poisons her patients. Using female roles in society doesn't have to be lame, it can add realism and charm. In terms of personality, I would not say female characters and male characters have to differ much. I'm not here to say that men and women are the same, because that would not be true. You don't need to always account for it, though. In my experience, when you write, you tend to account for on instinct, because you as a person know men and women, and intuitively realize what personalities you find more or less feminine. Forcing it generally creates stereotypes. And, lastly, the final question. What's a fully fleshed out female character from media that you would say is very well done? In Ted Chiang's Story of Your Life, you follow a linguist named Louise, who's highly capable and intelligent at the task at hand. A writer could have chosen to write her as a sexless scientist, totally devoid of the feminine. However, Chiang decides to show her as a lover, as a mother, as a young woman in some parts of the story. What sticks out to me is that this woman is totally multifaceted. Yes, she's an intellectual, she's a driving force in the story, but that does not mean she cannot love her daughter in a motherly way, for example. Why I love this example so much is because obviously, if you've read Story of Your Life, it's not really a character based in its plot. It is a work on the concept of free will. It is not a story about women. However, Louise feels human and tangible, the way I might look at my mother or a teacher I've had. Her being a woman is innate. It can be positive or negative, but it is part of her without being about that. That is the highest art of writing women, if you ask me. Big thanks to my girlfriend for helping me out and eloquently answering those questions. To end, I think the biggest takeaway you should get from this video is that you should not feel pressured to write female characters as sterile, flawless, short-haired, androgynous angels. At the end of the day, make sure that the women in your story are of all kinds. And if I can speak personally, I would rather read a story with no women whatsoever than a single woman inserted just to be overly sexualized like I gave the example of Magda in The Keep. I don't want to read a novel that's 20% the author's wish fulfillment, sex/romance fantasy. Either make it low-key or keep it for a separate romance story. You're more likely to piss off readers by doing something badly than by not doing it at all.